The night was cold, and the city skyline shimmered with the glow of 1,000 lights. Inside one of the tallest office buildings, the air was filled with the sound of typing keyboards, ringing phones, and the muffled voices of busy executives. In the grand lobby, polished marble floors reflected the glow of an enormous chandelier, its brilliance a stark contrast to the man quietly sweeping the floor beneath it. Samuel, a middle-aged janitor, moved his broom with practiced ease, his calloused hands showing years of hard work. His uniform was worn and slightly faded, yet he carried himself with quiet dignity. He had worked in this building for over a decade, cleaning up after people who barely acknowledged his presence. But Samuel never complained. He believed in honest work, even if it went unnoticed. That night, as he wiped down the reception desk, a group of well-dressed executives walked past, laughing and talking loudly about an upcoming gala. Among them was none other than Richard Stanton, the CEO of the company and one of the wealthiest men in the city. Tall, sharp-featured, and always dressed in an impeccable suit, Richard had built his empire from the ground up. But over the years, his success had hardened him. To him, power and money were everything. As the group passed, Richard suddenly stopped, his eyes narrowing at Samuel. A look of disgust crossed his face as he took in the janitor's worn-out shoes and calloused hands. "You missed a spot," he said coldly, pointing to a barely visible smudge on the floor. The executives chuckled. Samuel quickly bent down to clean it, but Richard wasn't done. "How long have you been working here?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "About 12 years, sir," Samuel replied politely. 12 years? And this is all you've accomplished?" Richard scoffed. "Still scrubbing floors. No ambition. No drive. That's why you'll always be a janitor." The group erupted in laughter. Samuel swallowed the lump in his throat. He was used to being overlooked. But tonight, the humiliation burned deeper. He had spent years ensuring this building was spotless. Yet in Richard's eyes, he was nothing more than a speck of dust. "Maybe if you worked harder, you wouldn't be stuck in the same place," Richard added before walking away, leaving Samuel standing there, gripping his mop tightly. That night, Samuel went home feeling heavier than usual. He wasn't ashamed of his job. He took pride in it. But Richard's words echoed in his mind. Was this all his life would ever be? He looked around his small apartment, the peeling wallpaper, the flickering light bulb. He had always told himself that hard work was enough, but now he wasn't so sure. Meanwhile, Richard returned to his penthouse, sipping a glass of expensive whiskey as he stared out at the city below. He had built his empire on ruthless decisions, stepping on anyone who got in his way. To him, the world was divided into winners and losers. Samuel, he was just another loser. But fate had a strange way of humbling even the most powerful. A few days later, something happened that Richard never saw coming. It started with a phone call in the middle of the night, an urgent message that sent shockwaves through his life. Within hours, everything he had built, everything he had taken for granted, was suddenly slipping through his fingers. And when the dust settled, the last person Richard ever expected to see standing in front of him was the very man he had humiliated just days before. But this time, the roles had changed. What happened next left Richard speechless, and the entire world watching. A cold wind howled through the towering skyscrapers, rattling the windows of Richard Stanton's penthouse. He stood in the middle of his vast, modern living room, his phone slipping from his grip. The voice on the other end had just delivered news he never thought he'd hear. His company, his empire, was in trouble, serious trouble. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting. There were whispers of fraud, financial mismanagement, and a possible lawsuit that could tear everything apart. Investors were pulling out, the stock was plummeting, and worst of all, his most trusted business partner had betrayed him, taking millions and vanishing without a trace. Richard clenched his jaw. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. The next morning, he stormed into his office, expecting his employees to jump to attention like they always did. But instead, he was met with worried stares, hushed voices, and the undeniable tension of people who no longer saw him as an untouchable force. He barked orders, demanded answers, but the more he pushed, the more he realized how quickly his world was unraveling. The news spread fast. Reporters camped outside the building. Headlines painted him as a failing businessman, and shareholders were calling for his resignation. For the first time in his life, Richard felt powerless, and he hated it. Meanwhile, across the city, Samuel sat in his small kitchen, stirring a cup of coffee. He had heard the news, seen the headlines, and for a moment, he felt a strange sense of justice. But he wasn't the type to celebrate another man's downfall, even if that man had humiliated him. Life had a way of humbling everyone, and it seemed Richard Stanton was finally learning that lesson. But Samuel had bigger things to worry about. His daughter Emily was sick. She had been for months, and the medical bills were piling up. No matter how hard he worked, it was never enough. He had picked up extra shifts, taken on side jobs, but the hospital still wanted payments he couldn't afford. One evening, as he was finishing up his shift, Samuel overheard two executives whispering in the hallway. "Did you hear? Stanton's losing everything. He's desperate," one of them said. "Serves him right," the other scoffed. "But he still has that property, his last asset. If he loses that, he's done." Samuel didn't know much about business, but he knew what desperation looked like. And if there was one thing he had learned about powerful men, it was that when they were desperate, they were willing to do anything to hold on to what they had left. The next day, as Richard sat in his office, staring at the legal documents that could determine his future, his assistant hesitantly walked in. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "I don't have time for visitors," Richard snapped. "He says it's important." With a sigh, Richard rubbed his temples. "Fine, send him in." When the door opened, he almost laughed. In disbelief, standing before him, in the same worn uniform, was Samuel, the janitor. "What the hell do you want?" Richard asked, his patience worn thin. Samuel didn't flinch. He looked around the office. The expensive furniture, the paintings, the desk that probably cost more than his entire apartment. And yet, the man sitting behind it looked empty, like someone who had lost everything. "I heard about what's happening," Samuel said, "and I think I can help you." Richard let out a cold, bitter laugh. "You? A janitor? Help me?" Samuel ignored the insult. "I may not know business the way you do, but I do know people, and right now you don't need a businessman. You need someone who understands struggle." Richard leaned back, crossing his arms. "And what do you know about struggle?" Samuel met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "More than you ever will." For the first time in his life, Richard Stanton didn't have a snide remark. He had spent years believing that money was the only thing that separated men like him from men like Samuel. But now, as he sat there, stripped of his power, his wealth slipping through his fingers, he realized something unsettling. Samuel, the janitor he had humiliated, still had something he didn't. Resilience. A kind of strength that came from years of hardship, from knowing what it was like to have nothing and still keep going. "What's your offer?" Richard finally asked, his voice quieter than before. Samuel took a deep breath. I know about the last property you own, the one that could save you. You need someone who knows the people who actually work in this city. Not just the ones in suits, but the real workers. If you want to rebuild, you need their trust. And right now, nobody trusts you. Richard frowned. And you think they trust you? Samuel nodded. They don't just trust me. I am one of them. The room fell into silence. Richard had always believed power meant control, that leadership was about commanding fear and respect. But now, as he looked at Samuel, he saw something he had never understood before. Leadership wasn't just about power. It was about people. For the first time, Richard Stanton had no choice but to listen. Because the only person who could help him now was the very man he had once looked down on. And what happened next? No one could have predicted. Richard stared at Samuel, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had spent his entire life believing that men like Samuel were invisible, insignificant, and yet here he was, offering a lifeline when no one else would. A janitor, the same man he had humiliated just days ago. For the first time in his life, Richard hesitated. He had always been the one in control, the one calling the shots. But now, he had nothing left to lose. And Samuel, despite everything, was willing to help. Richard leaned forward, studying the man in front of him. If I say yes, what's in it for you? Samuel didn't blink. I don't need anything from you, he said simply. But I know what it's like to be desperate. And I know what it's like to feel like the world has turned its back on you. If there's a way to fix this mess, I want to be part of it. Not for you, for the people who work here, the ones who actually built this company while you sat in this office. Richard exhaled slowly. The truth stung more than he cared to admit. He had been so consumed by power that he never once thought about the people beneath him, the ones who kept everything running, and now they were the only ones who could save him. Over the next few days, Samuel introduced Richard to the people he had ignored for years. The janitors, the security guards, the cafeteria workers, the delivery staff, people who had seen Richard walk past them without a second glance. At first, they were hesitant, suspicious. Why should they help the man who never cared about them? But Samuel spoke for him. He reminded them that sometimes life humbles people in unexpected ways, and sometimes those who fall the hardest have the greatest chance to change. Richard, for the first time in his life, listened more than he spoke. He saw his company not through balance sheets and stock prices, but through the eyes of the people who truly made it work. And with their support, he slowly started to rebuild, not as the ruthless CEO he once was, but as someone willing to learn from his mistakes. But the biggest challenge was yet to come. The final board meeting had arrived. The investors, the shareholders, the executives, everyone was waiting to see if Richard Stanton would be forced out of his own company. The tension in the room was thick. As Richard stood at the head of the long conference table, knowing this was his last chance, the board members began their questions, their skepticism clear. Why should we believe you've changed? One of them asked. Before Richard could answer, the door opened. To everyone's surprise, Samuel walked in. A murmur spread through the room as he stepped forward. A janitor in a board meeting. It was unheard of. But Samuel stood tall, looking each person in the eye. For years I've worked in this building, Samuel began. And for years people like me were invisible. But when everything fell apart, Richard did something I never expected. He listened, he learned, and he tried to fix what he broke. That's more than I can say for a lot of people in power. The room fell silent. Samuel turned to Richard. I don't know if a man can change in a few weeks, but I know that when he lost everything, he didn't run. He faced the people he ignored. And that has to count for something. The board members exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. Finally, the chairman sighed. The company is still in trouble, but if you're willing to rebuild the right way, you have our support. For now, it wasn't a victory. Not yet, but it was a second chance. And sometimes that was enough. In the weeks that followed, Richard made changes. Not just in the company, but in himself. He restructured the way employees were treated, ensuring fair wages and better working conditions. He created programs to support workers who had once been overlooked, and he never again walked past a janitor without saying hello. One evening, as Richard left his office, he spotted Samuel mopping the lobby floor. For the first time, he didn't see just a janitor. He saw the man who had saved him. "You don't have to do this job forever, you know," Richard said. "You're capable of so much more." Samuel smiled, leaning on his mop. "I know, but for now, this is where I'm needed." Richard nodded. "Thank you, Samuel." "For everything." Samuel simply chuckled. "Life has a funny way of humbling us, doesn't it?" Richard couldn't help but agree, because in the end, the wealth, the power, the titles, none of it mattered if you lost sight of the people around you. And sometimes, the ones we least expect are the ones who teach us the most important lessons. With that, Richard walked out into the night, not as the man he once was, but as someone who had finally learned what true success really meant. And for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace.